We're going to kickstart the day then with the Road to Empowerment, a panel discussion exploring our nation's achievements, challenges, and future plans to guarantee that creativity can flourish in an increasingly competitive market. We're delighted to invite this panel's host to the stage, John Kampfner, CEO of the Creative Industries Federation. Please give him and the panelists a round of applause as they come to the stage.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here at Rich Mix. It's an amazing place. This is the introduction, as Louise said, to several days of what I'm sure will be fabulous discussions and activities here as part of the Zealous conference. And what we're going to do, I hope, with this esteemed panel is to really set the scene in perhaps in a most general sense, the state of the creative industries, the state of the arts, the state of cultural education in London and around the UK and internationally. Just very briefly, the Creative Industries Federation, in case any of you don't know, was formed a year ago, and in fact tomorrow evening at as far away in London terms as you can think of at Television Centre in White City, we will be having our huge gala to celebrate our first anniversary. And it's been an amazing journey for us to try to establish the unifying voice for the publicly invested arts, for cultural education, and for the commercial creative industries and creative tech and much more besides under one roof, from the very largest companies to the very smallest organizations and startups. With me today are Paul Owens, CEO of BOP, with whom we have been working, Caroline Norbury, CEO of Creative England, who've been fabulously collaborative with us around the UK at our 8 roadshows and many other events besides, and one of our founders, Peter Bazalgette, Baz, who's amongst many other things in an incredibly illustrious career, is chair of Arts Council England. So we're going to talk about anything and everything relating to the creative industries and Creative UK and the state of the UK. Paul, maybe if I can begin with you, because yesterday in The Observer there was a piece that was written about the findings in our annual report, and particularly the work that we're going to be doing with BOP on the, we're going to be doing 2 global trends reports in the course of 2016, and there was a taster of the first set of inquiry into that yesterday. Just summarize for us where you think Britain is. What should we be celebrating and what should we be worrying about internationally when it comes across the whole gamut of the creative industries?
Okay, it's always good to start with the small questions on a Monday morning, I find, just to get the brain operating. Thanks, John. So for those of you who don't know who I am and who BOP is, we're a consultancy practice. We do strategy, management consulting. We work in the UK, but in the last 5 years, we've increasingly started working across the world. So we have projects in China and Taiwan. We have projects in Latin America, and we're just starting a big project in Dubai, actually. So we've got quite an interesting global perspective on this. So just to try and answer your question in as snappy a way as possible, I think that there is a tendency in the UK to get all PR-ish about our creative industries and our creative economy and to talk ourselves up. This is not a bad thing in itself. And I think it's very much part of the kind of policy speak you hear on platforms across the country. But I think we have to do so increasingly with much, much more global self-awareness. I mean, we all know that most of the creative industry markets that everyone works in, including artists in the East End, people in West London, Bristol, or wherever, they're increasingly global in all kinds of sophisticated ways. But I think what's changed in the last 10 to 15 years, and it has changed dramatically, is the amount of attention and investment that's going into creative industries more broadly in other countries and other regions of the world. The US has always been dominant culturally and also in terms of just the sheer size of the media, entertainment, creative business. But what's interesting, I think, is the way that developing economies, China, Brazil, other places like that, are starting to look at this very, very seriously and seeing the creative industries as an absolutely key plank of not just their future economies, but also the sort of the way they want to design and build their societies. And we're seeing huge amounts of institutional level investment going into this in these countries. I'm talking about I'm talking about university education in China. There are something like 4 or 5 times as many design graduates coming out of Chinese universities at the moment. A lot of them come over here as well. Even in places like Brazil, which at the moment is experiencing a huge financial crisis. The amount of money that's going into supporting artists, supporting cultural organizations, supporting media organizations, the amount of capital that's flowing into that is absolutely enormous. So the UK's got absolutely huge and enormous natural advantages. Most of our natural advantages, though, are actually historic. They're to do with what we've invested in the past and the institutions we've built up in the past. And I think we've got to look outwards and try and really tune in to what other people are doing and think about whether or not our institutions, our levels of investment, our support structures are fit for purpose for this new, much, much more global, more competitive environment. So that's a very sort of short answer to a long question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And we'll probe a bit more deeply into the question of trying to answer your question about whether or not we are investing and whether we are prioritising on education in a second. Caroline, Creative England has offices. It's sort of ubiquitous around England, around the English regions, offices everywhere. I was wondering, in addition to maybe following up on any points that Paul has made, if you could paint, by way of introduction, an overview of the state of the creative industries outside London, across England and beyond that, across the UK.
Hello? Oh, it is on here. Sorry. Yes, I would say that there are. It's really interesting when you talk about creative centres and you talk about creative clusters, because what do we mean by that? I suppose if you look at the States, when one talks about creative clusters, there are lots and lots of brilliant cities, but actually there are 2 preeminent creative clusters, which are New York and LA. And I think that we've got to sort of think about our language when we're talking about how to support creativity, because the outside of London we have several of our larger cities where they actually do have a really, really healthy and sizable creative density. So if you look at somewhere like Manchester or Bristol, to some extent Liverpool, although slightly smaller, but actually creativity is everywhere. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about our creativity and the way that we talk about creativity and the way that we talk about the creative sector is that we still imagine that we all have to be in a space to unlock that. And actually, some of the most creative businesses that we support are found in the most unlikely places. So I'm going to give you a very prescient example. So we have the founding principles of Creative England are that talent is everywhere, but access to opportunity isn't. That's something that we wrote when we first all sat in a little room, I don't know, nearly 5 years ago now. And so the strategy that we have deployed in order to fulfill our mission is to help people access money, markets, and networks. Those are the 3 things that can give people opportunity. And one of the most interesting companies that I wanted just to touch on, to give you an example around place being important but not the be-all and end-all, is a company called Pixel Toys, who we supported about, I don't know, we found them 2-3 years ago now. And they're based in Leamington Spa, which is not really a creative city. It's not even a city. Anybody here from Leamington? Lovely place, but you wouldn't think it's a creative hub.
We're thinking anyway, Paris of the Midlands.
Maybe. Anyway, 2 guys, Pixel Toys, video games company. We put a tiny bit of money into them, and we gave them access to that money. We gave them access to networks, so we introduced them to a whole range of different people who could help them. One of those people were Microsoft, and we helped them get to markets. In October of this year, or maybe it was September, anyway, in the autumn, when Apple do their reveal of their new product. On the stage, to demonstrate the game-playing functionality of the new iPhone 6S, comes up Andy Wafer, who is the man behind Pixel Toys based in Leamington Spa. So my point is, there is an awful lot of creativity and creative cities going, all around the UK. But actually, just focusing on place rather than how you support talent and how you give that talent the opportunity to thrive, no matter where they're from or no matter what their background is, or whether where they grew up, where they're working, and so on. That is the real challenge that I think we have to conquer. We have to deal with at the moment.
And just briefly to follow up on that, is the devolution agenda, and the government and George Osborne are talking increasingly about that, is it really having traction now? Are you getting a sense that when companies or organisations start to develop scale, there isn't necessarily, here Shoreditch is obviously one of the epicentres of clustering and tech coming together with creative industries, which is fabulous. But are you getting a sense really that people are sticking where they are and they're not feeling that draw?
No, they're not. They're moving. They're absolutely moving. So another company that we've worked with who working in face recognition software, they're moving to LA. There are lots and lots of companies there. They will move nearer to where the money is and where the buyers are. And that's the thing to address, I think, which is where is capital? And capital in this country is in London. There's the beginnings, I would say, of sort of a cluster of regional capital in somewhere like Manchester. It's a bit more visible, that private capital. I do think that, going back to your point around the devolution, I think that the creative sector is getting quite a fair crack of the whip in terms of visibility when it comes to devolution. Practically, however, most of the money that is available through those devolved budgets is for infrastructure, it's for capital. And our industry, yeah, it needs a bit of that, but actually what our industry needs a lot of time is risk money. It needs little bits of risk money, it needs revenues that can help people to take a punt on your idea or your prototype or whatever. That is getting harder and harder and harder to find.
Interesting. Baz, follow up if you would on either of the international set of questions or the devolution one. And also, you now chair of Arts Council, very much investing in and supporting arts across England. But you come from a commercial TV background. Give us a sense of where you think the cross-fertilization is happening between arts and creative companies as well. So you have three options to look at.
I'm already bewildered, John, by your question. Three options at this time of the morning.
It is
early in the new year.
It is a bit early.
It's more than a chap can deal with. Yes, I think I'll pick you up on your third option, if I may, and partially ignore it and go off in a direction of my own. May I do that?
Excellent. That's what we like.
Thank you.
He didn't go where he was today.
Listening to my fellow panelists, and indeed to your questions, John, I think it's really good to remind ourselves, and this is not policy, this is more philosophy, which again is, hope not to exhaust you before lunch. Why do we care about the creative industries? Why are they important? Why do they have some tax breaks and some other underpinning, like the BBC license fee, that the boot and shoe manufacturers, amongst others, do not have? What is that about? And I just think it's good to remind ourselves from time to time that the creative industries, and you can agree or disagree with the definition, but we have the definition, we've had it now for almost 20 years. It has a democratic significance, it has a cultural significance, and it has an economic significance. So it's really, really important. It would be important if it was just one of those things. Democracy, because all of the organs of publication in which we debate and discuss our society, our politics, our way of life, our values, are all part of the creative industries. Cultural, I need hardly sit on this stage today and say why it is culturally significant. It is how we define our culture. It is the national conversation. And that's, in that context, I'll come back to your crossover between arts and creative industries. And economic, because the creative industries are growing at more than twice the rate of the economy and growing jobs even faster than that. So it's incredibly important that. when it comes to the economic considerations, I see that the biz department, I see that industrial strategies are out of fashion in biz. We hear from the current biz minister who used to be the culture minister. But I've got news for him. There's been an industrial strategy for the creative industries for yonks, but nobody's ever actually identified it as such. The question is how we can enhance it. Because we have tax credit breaks or subsidies, whatever you want to call them, for everything from film and television drama and computer games to orchestral performance, performing arts, and I hope shortly art exhibitions. Why would you put those tax credit systems into across the commercial and the non-commercial sector? Partly to help them thrive, but partly because of their importance culturally as well as economically. And the crossover you refer to, and then I'll stop, John. Yes, the crossover is huge. So I think in the last 3 or 4 years we've managed to remind people that arts and culture, which was always part of the definition of the creative industries since the late 90s, has this symbiotic relationship. So, you know, we did an interesting thing a couple of years ago, a spillover study, so-called, between the publicly supported theatre and the commercial theatre. And what it showed was that talent, such as Danny Boyle, whom we were talking about in the coffee bar beforehand, because his latest film's a turkey, by the way. But nevertheless, Danny Boyle, the brilliant Oscar-winning director, he said, of Slumdog Millionaire, was in fact trained as a director at the Royal Court Theatre with public support. A similar story with Steve McQueen, the director of 12 Years a Slave. That's the anecdotal bit of it. The spillover study shows that the talent, whether it's design talent, lighting talent, directing talent, performing talent, goes out of the subsidized or publicly supported sector into the commercial theatre sector, into the TV sector, into the film sector, and back again. It flows both ways. So there's an interesting thing going on there. And so all along the line, there is public intervention as well as private commercial success. The relationship between the two is important, but it's in a sector that is more important than any other sector because of its democratic and cultural significance.
And to you and to Caroline, just want to follow up one of Paul's points, which is the sort of no complacency mantra. To what degree are we in danger of believing our own hype and being caught up and overtaken by other countries?
I think that is very dangerous, actually. I completely agree. We absolutely need to do lots of clapping. And we really, I think because we didn't really talk up the arts particularly, let alone the creative industries, until very, very recently. I agree, we need to continue to advocate. But there is a real issue around where competition is coming from. So made in, the Chinese government slogan, which was around made in China, changed a couple of years to designed and created in China. And so our competitive edge, which has always been around around ideas and around creativity, I do think is under challenge. And I think one of the problems is that we live and work and operate in a global society. And one of the big challenges that we have to deal with is one of diversity, of making sure that the people who are making this stuff in the UK actually reflect that global, diverse market. And I'm sad to say we don't. We're not a massively diverse industry at all, and there are some parts of it which are the antithesis of diverse. There are some that are better, but do we have enough of the right role models? No. Do we have enough people looking to back risk takers? No. Is our education system under threat in terms of supporting a rich and full artistic education? Yes. So I do think that there are some real challenges, and I think that we can be accused of being slightly complacent.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, I mean, we did an event with Mobo in September at the BFI, and David Iolowo, the star of Selma, as you'll know, did a fantastic speech, a fantastic lament about the extent to which actually, in his opinion, the problem is getting worse, not better, and more sort of globally renowned black actors are moving to the States rather than staying here for lack of investment and lack of opportunities. That certainly was a contention. Baz, just on the no complacency point.
Well, and I'll come to the diversity point as well. I think it's very important. I was just going to say, so we completely agree with what you say about the international competition. And we need to define where we have advantage, and we need to enhance that advantage. I'd suggest a couple of our advantages are that I don't believe you can have a really vibrant, long-term creative culture unless you're in a democracy, and we have that advantage. I secondly think that we have the advantage of the English language, and those are serious market-leading advantages that we need to work out how to exploit. And perhaps because I think you're going to come back on it, let's come back to diversity in a minute.
Okay, Paul.
I just want to say that I totally disagree with Baz about the fact that a few tax breaks equals an industrial policy. I think that...
And I agree with you, by the way,
right.
But I'll explain why in a minute.
Now, we want a bit of disagreement breaking out. Continue with this theme.
I think there's a terrible sort of worrying sort of default position in the UK, which is that the ultimate you can ask from government is to give you a tax break, you know, and that becomes everything that you ever talk about. And I think that's very dangerous. It's incredibly short term. I think we don't have a strategy really in this country. We have lots of different individual things going on, but there isn't anything that brings it all together. I mean, to be fair to the Creative Industries Federation, that's one of the things they're sort of trying to do, you know, and I really like the way you're bringing together all the bits of the spectrum to look at this. But I just don't think there is a connection in the thinking at a national level between what are these tax breaks for? What do we want this foreign direct investment for? Yeah. What are we doing in terms of talent, in terms of education? What are we doing in terms of these big issues around markets and who controls access to the markets? All of that stuff just gets shoved aside, shoved under the carpet in chasing short-term policies and short-term cash. There is no proper long-term thinking in the UK about the future of the creative industries.
Sorry, Caroline, you go.
Okay. I'm not quite as pessimistic as you.
I'm not pessimistic. I'm just saying.
Oh, okay. I wouldn't sum it up quite in the way that you have. I think that there is. I think you're right. We have a whole variety of strategies and a whole variety of players who, under various sorts of guises and formations, you know, we've got the Creative Industries Federation, the work that you're doing, the Creative Industries Council. They've published a strategy which is largely, you know, a set of again, smallish things that together we can all achieve. But where I would agree with you, however, is the lack of mission and vision. About, I don't know, a long time ago, probably 10, maybe 15 years ago, I spent some time with the Korean government, and they were looking to set up cultural centres in Europe. And what was really, really interesting was they just went for it. I took them on a tour around some really exciting things that we were doing. I was working in Bristol at the time, what we were doing there. And within a year, they'd set up a cultural centre. Within 5 years, they had a really high-performing video games industry. Now they've got one of the biggest pop music markets in the world, and they're absolutely, you know, the go-to market for the Chinese consumer. There's a really interesting economist called Mariana Mazzucato, and she has written an excellent book called Mission-Orientated Finance, which is quite hard, but anyway, it's worth actually just taking the top line of what she's saying, because I think the Korean government and the success that they've had with their creative sector absolutely exemplifies all of the really important points that she makes, which is have a bloody vision. You know, if what we're trying to do is to support our creative sector, then put that at the centre of all of your policies and your strategies. And as a whole, rather than lots of small steps, which is largely what we do, actually decide that we are going to grow and support the things, the areas where we do have a unique advantage.
The reason I agree with Paul, and therefore apparently disagree with myself, which is an unfortunate position for you to put me in, Paul,
On a Monday morning.
and I do hold you responsible for this, is that my point was, and I've made this point to government ministers till I'm blue in the face, we actually have many of the elements of an industrial strategy. So to hear people say, I don't believe in industrial strategies, is bollocks. When you've already got one, it just happens to be piecemeal and not very effective. So we have, in some places, great education for arts and creative and design and so That's part of an industrial strategy for creative industries. We have the BBC license fee. That's part of an industrial strategy. We have, as I said, the tax credits. Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned them because they're a bit of a cul-de-sac in a way. But you see my point, that actually some of the elements of an industrial strategy are there. So, as you say, Caroline, we're lacking the vision. So here's a vision.
Sure.
And I'd like to hear the federations say it, and they may have said it, in which case you can smack my hand. Why don't we get everybody to agree that we want to double the size of the creative industries in the next 20 years? Now, if you said that's our ambition, then you'd say, well, what do we have to do to double the creative industries in the next 20 years? And then to answer the question of what you do to double them, you'd start to build the strategy you need to achieve that objective. And that's the sort of vision we need to do the sort of things we need to do. And actually, we know most of it already. We just need to turbocharge it. Caroline, you're doing a lot of it, but you're doing a lot of it with quite small amounts of funding.
Yeah.
Tiny.
Yeah, exactly. But small, but perfectly formed.
Baz, I think, can I, as a consultant, I need to correct you there.
You're going to disagree with me again, are you?
Doubling the size of the creative industries is not a vision. It's simply a way of measuring whether your vision has been a success.
Sodding is a vision.
It's a target.
It's a target.
It's a vision.
You need something a bit juicier than that.
It's a vision.
You need to go
I
back
think
to...
when you
pretty
double the
juicy.
size of the creative industries because of its democratic, cultural, and economic significance, that is a vision, my friend. Put your spectacles on properly.
It's a target.
Look at the vision.
Right.
If there are any cobwebs in the audience, if there's any sleep in your eyes, they've been knocked out by now. A couple of quick things, and then I want to throw it open to the audience, because I'm sure you've all got some really interesting questions and perspectives to put. Baz, you just wanted to follow up on the diversity point quickly. Then I also want to ask quickly about the relationship between creative industries and creative tech. And then I just wanted to finish up on the education point as well, which is where we began.
The creative industries are mostly small companies, mostly casualized, freelance workers. Those are the sorts of industries which it's very difficult for people to break into a charmed circle who aren't part of that network. Part of the diversity problem of the creative industries, and for me it's a problem of not so much for the people who can't get into it, it's a problem for the creative industries, because the creative industries are not drawing on all the talents of this country, and they need to for their own survival and success. It is that, you know, if you're casualized and freelance, then people who have the bunk of mum and dad to rely on have a better chance. If you're casualized, then people who have personal contacts and networks and parents and relatives already working in the creative industries can give them the interview, the open door. So diversity is a very, very important challenge. My own belief is that because quite a lot of the creative industries come attached to government involvement of one sort or another, whether it's the Arts Council or whether it's the BBC or whatever, I think that you need to attach conditions to public money. And I think one of those important conditions is diversity. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail, but both in terms of employment in arts organizations that are publicly supported, and also in terms of something we call the creative case for diversity, which is about audiences and programming. We now at the Arts Council attach conditions. We ask funded organizations to sign up to objectives for improving diversity, and we measure them, and we publicly say how we're doing, including where we're not doing very well. And we report on that annually, which we did in December.
I've never understood, leaving aside the issues of a good society and social justice, I've never understood the economic case in the commercial creative industries for not being diverse, in that the more your senior management team, the more your workforce, the more your board of directors reflect the country at large. It's not just a question of ethnicity, it's a much broader question as well, including geographic and everything else. The broader your content, the broader your audience, the bigger your bottom line. So therefore I never quite get why they don't do it.
But nobody sets out not to be diverse, they just don't concentrate on it. It's just the default position. And
if
it
you're
isn't
looking
just
to
because
improve
of
your bottom line.
And it's not just of the conditions of the creative industry. Let's remember, my opinion, and evolutionary biology would bear me out, whatever you're going to say would bear me out, we are tribal by nature. We tend to give breaks to and favor people who are like us, whom we identify with. That is how we've come out of our tribal background in evolutionary terms. So if that's what racism is, and it is an element of racism, we are, in that sense, racist, naturally. So what you have to do is concentrate although there are evident benefits to doing what you say, John, you have to concentrate on improving things and getting out of the default position that is, if you like, part of human nature.
Caroline, any thoughts?
No, I agree with Peter. Right.
As someone almost said. Right, tech. Here we are in Shoreditch, epicenter of creative tech. Is an app designer a cultural person or a techie? The answer is a bit of both in different proportions. We at the Federation working closely, increasingly, with tech companies and with Tech London advocates and others. Just want to get a sense from any of you or all of you of what tricks are being achieved and what tricks are being missed between creative tech and creative industries and arts, and how can we get that join to work better?
Well, I'll talk about one thing first, which is close to my mind. Here in Shoreditch, which is allegedly Silicon Roundabout, which is allegedly the most powerful tech concentration in our country, 47% of tech and digital companies are unhappy with the speeds of their broadband. 47%, okay? In fact, I was reading about one creative company in Clerkenwell whose client, I think, was Ford, and they were making video for Ford, and instead of sending it to them or linking them to it online to view rough cuts, they were putting it on a memory stick on a bike because they were so fed up with the slow upload speeds and download speeds. Now, talking of strategies, and it's not just to do with the government, it's to do with the private sector as well. 50% of people in the world live in cities at the moment. That's going to be 70% in 20 years' time. The successful creative companies of the future are all going to be in urban situations, and And Leamington Spa. I meant Leamington Spa, the Paris of the Midlands. I was referring to that specifically. And so it's not just London, and it's not just the so-called 8 core cities. It's probably 30, 40 of our major cities need super, ultra-fast broadband. And that is something that the private sector and government between them have got to really have a strategy for and have got to deliver on. And we've concentrated up to now, for perfectly good reasons, on getting broadband spread to up to 90 and 95% across the country, and there are good reasons for that in terms of social inclusion. But we really have to concentrate on this objective now. Google Fiber, in some places Google is now investing in putting ultra high speed in, and Google Fiber in Kansas, they went into Kansas in the Midwest, and they put in high-speed connections, and there's been a clear, in the last couple of years, growth in small tech and digital companies. So I think that's a really important thing we're falling down on at the moment.
So what was the question, John?
Tech, the join between creative tech and creative industries.
All I'll say is I'm looking out into the room and I can see some sort of the younger generations there, and I think that the tech creative divide or distinction, I think, doesn't really exist in the minds and imaginations and even practices of a lot of the emerging small businesses in this part of London, and that's a great thing. The really big question, though, I think, the really big question about tech and about the future in terms of the way all of this is going to go is who controls access to the market? Where are the eyeballs? Where, who's and at the moment, and it looks like it's going to be the same for the next 10, 15 years, it's the dreaded GAFAT. We all know what GAFAT is. And I think that any strategy that Baz and everyone else cooks up in the next week or so for the future of creative industries has to deal with what are we going to do on this island about the hegemony of GAFAT. Because that's bigger than the questions about...
To those who don't know,
tech.
explain.
Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Twitter. They control the world.
Caroline, follow that.
I'll answer it in a slightly different way, I suppose. One of the things that Creative England does is we work across film, TV, video games, creative and digital businesses. So we make investments in software companies, unfortunately outside of London. But we do invest in film, no matter where you're from. And we invest in, as I said, games. And we work with a lot of small indie companies. So we see lots of different types of content propositions, tech propositions, data, software, and so on. But the bit that I don't see a lot of, and the bit where we struggle, is that when it comes to designing content, we still don't have that many multidisciplinary teams. So quite often, somebody will come to us with and we'll be working with them on a film idea, and we'll be talking to them probably at quite an early stage around how that might work on a different platform, or in a different, in a different environment with different types of users and so on. But they're no, it's a film, we're going to sort it, we're going to get it made first, and then we're going to think about the game. And actually, some of the most exciting content that I've seen, which does traverse all of those different worlds, is developed and conceived at the same time in a team environment. And I think this is something, I'm not an educationist, but I think there is something very specific about the way in which we develop talent, which is that we still adhere very much to that, that individual hero sort of figure, rather than group dynamics. And I'll give you another example. If you think about some of the best drama at the moment on the screen in your sitting room, I'm thinking about something like House of Cards. House of Cards is a group effort. Not only is it a group effort in terms of the writing, but in terms of the design and the lighting and so on, it's a team effort. And I think that one of the things I hope it's changing. I see glimmers of it with much, much younger people that we're working with. But I think that sort of building multidisciplinary teams and exploring the multidisciplinary journey of content is an area where I think that we really could do amazing things, but we need to change the way in which we support talent and the way in which we educate talent.
Right, final strand in our mini tour d'horizon. We're going back to education. And Paul, just some thoughts to kick off from you. Among our member survey, 90% regard education or what they see as the government's deprioritization of cultural education as the single biggest challenge. They're talking about not just issues around tertiary and skills and training, but fundamentally the EBAC plans and the idea that there are core subjects, which very few people, I think, would disagree with that notion, but that creative endeavor and the creative subjects are not regarded as core. And the Prime Minister, in his questions a few months ago, reiterated that point. We and partners are doing a lot of work on this. Our team were into DFE this morning, seeing Nick Gibb and others. Just give us a sense, Paul, of where you see the situation and where you see the potential problems lying in the future in terms of not just personal development, but in terms of the creative industries and our success globally.
Well, it seems like we're going in the opposite direction from the rest of the world. So I think all of this started off in terms of let's try and emulate the really successful growth economies in other parts of the world who are achieving sort of explosive big growth. And they seem to be doing that by educating people only on the right side of their brains to have rational sort of deductive skills and do lots of maths and science. And of course, just as we've come to think, is it the left side? Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
That's the left.
That's the left.
Is,
okay. Oh God, that explains that. Okay, sorry.
Swap your hemispheres, then carry on.
But what we seem to, so just as they're all going, actually, in this new, even more complex, even more crazy world we live in, as well as all that, you need empathy, creativity. We seem to be going in the other direction, which is very worrying. And I think actually that all of this, in the end, has an influence on the diversity question as well, because if that's really how you see your education system and that's how you treat arts and culture and creativity, then you are going to end up, I think, with an increasingly sort of layered, elitist education system where only certain kinds of people from certain kinds of background with certain kinds of education and certain kinds of abilities go through to do certain kinds of things. And I say that as a public school boy who went to an elite university alongside these two as well. And congratulations on being our diversity.
No, I'm your working class, yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
When you talk to, when you hear from somebody like Ian Callum, who's the chief designer of Jaguar Land Rover, he'll put up on his screen behind a picture of the latest incredible car, and Ian will point out that he studied at Glasgow School of Art, and then he went on to the Royal College of Art, and that most of the great designers in this industrial huge company, Jaguar Land Rover, had at some form of arts education. You're 17 times, by the way, more likely to win a Nobel Prize for Science if you studied the arts at some point in your life. Baz, you're looking...
Can I just say
Go on.
something? Can I just say something quickly optimistic? Because I don't want to be pessimistic about it. Which is
Go on, we like this Jeremiah approach.
I did some work with Neville Brody. Does everyone here know who Neville Brody is? No, I don't. He's the UK's most famous graphic designer, typographer. Fantastic guy. East End working class boy who became very famous. He did The Face and all that sort of stuff. And he said, and he's now a professor at Royal College of Art. He said to me that he thinks that what's going to happen is that the young people who are now going through school and are going to experience this new sort of very narrow curriculum, is they'll just simply vote with their feet or with their keyboard. And what they'll do is they'll just go and get their creative and cultural education somewhere else, outside school. And they'll just find a way of getting to where they want to get or need to get creatively by just finding it somewhere else. And then he really believes that because of technology, because of the way our social structures are changing, that that's going to be possible. So you actually don't have to rely on the sort of rather old-fashioned institution.
Curriculum-based, yeah. Baz, any quick thoughts on that before we throw it open?
Yeah, I know where it's all come from. It's come from very, very low educational standards in the state sector, which have been shocking and shameful and let down several generations since the 1960s. And they've tried to focus more and more on some very core skills. And it's got narrower and narrower in terms of how they're judged on attainment and in terms of examination and achievement. So I'm sympathetic to where it's come from. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that I don't think it has to be on a formal syllabus, as long as you can't be judged as a good school unless you give an all-round education.
Which is the Ofsted point.
Which is the Ofsted point about not being able to be judged outstanding unless you have a high quality of arts education in your school, which includes art room, includes drama club, and so on. So there's we are working...
Design technology has gone down 50%.
Well, and there I want to mention John Sorrell, who's chair of the Creative Industries Federation, who founded the Saturday clubs, which the Arts Council co-funds with his personal charity. And this is the idea that where, talking of going and getting it, where, you know, in a sense, you have creative flair, you're interested in design, whatever that means, whether that's video design, architecture, textile design, whatever. And you can go to these Saturday clubs in a very small number of places relatively at the moment. But the idea of specialist Saturday clubs for these sorts of people who want to go in this direction is a wonderfully exciting idea, and it could be turbocharged and made much bigger. And I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten what it was.
Maybe it will come back in questions. Right, questions, hands up. And we got any mics? Yeah, we got one. Yeah, we got one mic. Right, who's first? Don't be shy. Yeah, here. Exactly. And I won't say please to you, please say who you are, because we know. But to everybody else, when you get to questions, please say who you are and if you work for an organisation, who you represent.
No worries. So I don't know if this is on the air. This is mostly for Caroline and Paul, because you mentioned that we are exporting a lot of our expertise within the creative fields to, let's say, Korea and China. And are we taking anything back in return? Are we learning from what they're doing and then bringing it back and kind of feeding it back into our own kind of experience in our economy?
Should I say something about that? We are. So if you look at the film industry, for example, one of the things about one of the reasons why people come to film here is not just because of the tax breaks, but because we have an incredibly rich skills base, and increasingly that skills base is quite a foreign skills base actually. But we provide an environment that people enjoy living and working here. Another fact about this part of London, for example, is that I don't know the exact figures, but I think it's something like 40% of most of the startups around here are actually founded by PhD students who are non-British. So I think, you know, we obviously provide a brilliant environment. I'll tell you a funny story of when I was in last time I was in Singapore, and I took some animation companies. I was talking to some Singaporean animation companies, and they have fantastic facilities, fantastic technical capabilities. But the guy I was talking to said, the problem is, he said, I can't tell a joke. He said, I don't know how to tell jokes. I had a bit of a joke with him, but I don't think he got it, which was about democracy sort of helping sometimes when it comes to public conversation, and the ability to have a bit of a riff. But anyway,
Got
I think
filtered out.
that, sorry?
Got filtered out.
Probably, I don't know. Well, he really just didn't get it. But anyway, so I think that, we do absorb skills and crafts, but I think what the USP for a lot of British creativity is around conception and idea generation and so on. And without wanting to sound too arrogant, I don't see so much of that when I visit other places. That's what people want from us. And what we increasingly do, I think, is build on their skills base. But that goes back to the earlier point, really, about education, which is, are we really investing enough in the people who could actually, and the skills that actually execute our vision? It's one thing having a vision, but you need to execute it too.
Paul?
Just to sort of add to what Caroline said, I think that probably the richest and most exciting way in which we are swapping skills and knowledge and kind of competencies is probably through students and young people coming here and then going back, and then people following them, and then businesses being built with an international perspective. And I think we've only just seen the beginnings of that. I mean, London's famous for that, its cosmopolitanism. But I think with this next wave of globalization, as long as we keep decent immigration laws and have decent education policies, I think that's going to continue, and that'll be a rich source of learning and innovation for our country.
Right, more questions. Lady here, and then at the back, and then there, and then that'll probably, maybe we'll take all three questions together, and then we'll have a chance for everybody. Oh, sorry, I thought it was behind. There's four, so four. Right, you go there first. Right, we've got four questions, right.
Okay, I had my hand up and then didn't have my hand up. My name is Gail Spencer. I'm starting my own film festival this year. What I'm doing is encouraging filmmakers to make trailers as opposed to shorts and more expensive ventures, because if they build a portfolio that way, they've got a better chance of getting the funding that they require. I have a question which is related to the industrial strategy. I think one of the problems, although I accept the point about broadband, one of the biggest problems that we face in inner cities is housing. And I think what we need to do is concentrate on a strategy which houses creatives as well as providing funding and everything else, because we struggle in that respect considerably more than other people who have secured income or public sector jobs or what have you. So I'd like to ask the panel what they think about that in terms of including it in industrial
That's really
strategy.
good that you brought up that topic. Let's take lady behind you, and then we'll do two, and then we'll do the final two in clusters.
Yeah, Maria, I work at Art Angel. We're a funded organisation by the Arts Council. Just picking up on diversity, really, and what you've just been talking about in terms of foreign students that kind of flock to London, and that possibly isn't the most direct route to diversity, because you have to be extremely wealthy to come over here and study, and obviously that pushes the price up for everybody else, and just whether that's, it may look more diverse, but whether it's more diverse on an economic...
I don't, I mean, speaking about, I'm not sure that's what people necessarily interpret as diversity. I mean, for most universities now, irrespective of whether you talk about creative industries, foreign students are an incredible sort of cash cow. They help to cross-subsidize so much of academic endeavour. But anyway, let's go on housing first, and then we'll do the question of foreign students and the interaction with diversity. Baz, you want to go on housing?
Well, I was going to... By the way, I love the idea of your festival and the line you're taking, because it occurs to me in the TV business, which is my business, we've had to learn from the Americans over 30 years to make great, what the Americans call sizzle tapes, to sell TV shows and TV series and format ideas. And it's those sizzle tapes that attract the money. And why shouldn't the movie industry be doing the same? Not making trailers after the film is made, but sizzle tapes that promote what the idea is. So it's a really good idea. Yeah.
So that's what I'm encouraging them to do, because and also small businesses are struggling and could need their interaction.
But I like the idea. I wish you very good luck with it. Housing. Yeah, it's not just housing, it's affordable space. And so when I said we need high-speed broadband in our cities where everybody's going to be setting up their companies, we need affordable housing and affordable space. So there are some interesting objectives for the future.
If you lived in an ideal world and you were going to design a sort of theoretically beautiful industrial policy for the creative industries. Your industrial policy would encompass housing and property. And one of the things you would think of doing, I don't think you'd ever do it politically, is you could consider whether or not artists and creative workers are key workers in a city. And you can consider whether or not that city and national government, working with housing providers, working within the market, could provide subsidised living and working space for them as key workers in the way that some cities do for nurses and firemen and people like that. But you'd have to win the political argument first, which I think would be almost impossible in our country, that artists are key workers and not just spoiled middle-class kids mucking around.
I agree, Paul.
On the question of immigration, look, we're not going to solve our diversity challenge by people visiting this country, although there's nothing wrong with people visiting this country. I think it's a separate issue. If you don't think the number of people visiting this country as students is diverse enough, I think that's a point of view, and that's something you could address. But it's got nothing to do with our diversity challenges here. That's about people who live here, who are citizens of this country, who don't get a break into the creative industries. That's what it's about.
There's a separate policy question, which, with regard to the Home Office, which is, as we all know, around migration quotas or restrictions that are making it incredibly difficult for all kinds of creative industries and tech companies to fill spaces. But
can I just add something on the diversity question? Because I think that, which relates, I didn't talk, I can smell popcorn too. Yeah, lovely smell of popcorn. Which sort of relates to the conversation we were having about education. So I'm somebody who went to 7, 8 different schools. My dad was in the army, and rather than put me in a boarding school, which is what I wanted, I had to follow him around the world. But having said that, even though my education was very sort of broken up, I'm absolutely passionate about how important formal education is. But what I see reflected in how my own children, I'm the mother of 2 teenagers, how my own children interact with education, really makes me question how we're really addressing this. And there is a point to what I'm going to say to fit with you, which is that both of them hate school. One of them has managed to drop out of absolutely everything, every single formal education form that we've place that we've put him. But both of them are incredibly intellectually curious, and they have found their own ways of amassing knowledge, assessing stuff, experiencing all sorts of brilliant things, and both of them are very, very artistic. But my concern is that they're not part of networks. They're not part of physical networks, and that's the point about diversity, because actually that's one of the things that schools and colleges and universities provide you with. They provide you with networks, and I think that's the real challenge. How do we make sure that those sorts of physical networks, because actually getting a job does depend on meeting somebody, getting a break, getting a grant, getting a fund, getting investment depends upon, meeting people and looking at them in the whites of your eyes. And I think that's the real challenge around diversity. How do you diversify our existing networks?
Right, I think we've only got time for 3 or 4 minutes. There were 2 questions that were originally there at the back, and I think we're going to have to just stop there. Yep, there, and then at the very back row. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mandy Berry from Glant Media Ventures, an innovation agency. Earlier, Caroline mentioned, amongst the things like access to networks, also access to finance. And one of the things that I find a lot with the small creative industries organisations or arts and cultural companies that I work with is in terms of creating new products and services and some of those cross-platform ideas, cross-media ideas, is access to finance and not being able to access quite small amounts of finance. So not the large amounts that investors are usually going to give you, but sort of something that's 10K, 25K, maximum 50K perhaps. And the difficulty of accessing that either as loans with a really reasonable APR or as investment that could perhaps not be for equity but for profit share, royalty share, that there is a limited number of routes for that. And I wonder whether the panel agreed with me about that, and if so, what they think the vision for the future,
Right.
but doing it differently in terms of financing the sector could be.
Thank you. Let's hold that thought and go to the final question here in the very back row, just on your other side. There you go.
Jane Earl, I'm Chief Executive of Rich Mix, and popcorn is available for parent and baby screenings at very reasonable prices just up there. I want to just pick up on the diversity point. As an organisation, our board and senior management is 65% black and ethnic minority. Our programming is about 70% last year of our performers were from black and ethnic minority backgrounds, and over half are from Tower Hamlets and Hackney. That's great. The challenge for us is how do we help them build that network and then move between the bedroom where they started off and the Barbican where they should be ending up.
And in a sentence before we hand it over, how do you?
We do it by creating a lot of networks, by using a lot of our corporate partners to support the business skills that artists need. You know, many people come to us with great artistic skills, but actually they need all the support which people like Zealous give them in marketing, business case presentation, risk analysis, all of those sorts of things. But we're still not doing enough.
Thanks. Right, so we have diversity and we have the question of access to finance. Just on the access to finance point, we published a report in September with the November with the Institute of Chartered Accountants, which was basically just a how-to guide from state funding all the way through to VCs and even PEs and all the way through. It's incredibly, particularly on scale, on small scale, almost the smaller it is, the harder it is, and the question of developing, there's a huge body of work still to be done, developing an ROI for investors on small scale arts, and that's my thought. Over to you guys on both those
well,
points.
I'm only
and then we
going
have
to
to
say
conclude.
2 sentences because I think this is your area, but I think it's a huge need, but I also think things are very different to how they were 10, 20 years ago when it didn't exist at all. Yeah. I'll let Caroline speak for what she's doing and the other people she knows doing what she's doing, which wasn't happening 10, 20 years ago. Crowdfunding as well. Methods of arts funding, which we're developing, like the Arts Impact Fund, where we're looking at ways of loaning money, which is a mix of public money, charitable money, and bank money, to organisations that have a revenue flow that they can borrow against. So everybody's trying very hard to develop new models. It is very much needed, and I'm not being complacent, but there are some interesting things happening. Q.
There is, and we haven't got enough time to go over it all, but I'd say a couple of things, really. One is that small bits of money do really, really make a difference because, again, your real challenge as an artist is to have something to demonstrate your idea, and that costs money. And so somebody somewhere has to take a punt and take a risk. So I think we really, really need to keep making the case for those small bits of money that can only come from the public sector, because no matter what everybody says about the private sector, they don't take a risk. You know, they will absolutely back you, and they'll take a calculated risk. But a lot of the time, what you guys need is somebody who you haven't got anything to base a calculation on. So we need to keep those public sources. I do think that not just the crowd, but all of those other sort of alternative financing opportunities, such as peer-to-peer lending. I think that it's a much, much richer landscape now where you can raise funding, and I think it's probably much more profitable to put effort into raising funds through your own networks and through things like the crowd than it is to pursue some sort of pitch dream. I was going to say something else. I think that the most positive thing is that access to finance for small creative companies is a thing now. 5 years ago, it wasn't a thing. Nobody talked about it at all. And so now talking about creative companies needing access to funds in order to grow, in order to scale, in order to become investor ready, that's now a thing. It's got a title and it's got a strategy behind it, and it's got people talking about it in these sorts of places. But also importantly, people in banks, investment houses, equity firms, business angel networks. It's now a thing for them too, and that visibility, I think, is very, very positive.
I'm going to say one sentence.
One sentence. I'll hold you to it.
It's not sensible to have a conversation about access to finance without putting the question of management skills first, because that has to come first.
Okay, Jane, your point on Rich Mix. I mean, I think apart from saying, you know, let's engage and keep it up and everything else, I think we've sort of, well, A, we've run out of time, and B, we've looked at that. Right, just want to say thank you from me. If anybody wants to engage with the Federation, many hundreds of members already in our first year, from the very largest multinationals through to individuals, all the way through Zealous members and many others besides, do get in touch. Thank you all very much for listening to this first session. Thank you to Caroline, thank you to Paul, and thank you to Peter for what I hope was a very good introductory session. Thank you.